Alright, today on DadCraft we're going to take a look at where the data for your world is saved. Now, back when just Mojang was doing Minecraft, you'd have some different times where the game would crash and you wouldn't be able to get back in your world. That's much less reduced. I don't know why, but since Microsoft took a hand in making Minecraft. And so some of these things have been tightened up, but what we used to have to do was save off the world, zip it up and save it off, and then restore it from a saved backup. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you where Minecraft saves its data. So you can still do that. You can then zip up your world. You can put it on a server by unzipping it up there or copying it up there, and then share your world over the internet if you want to start a Minecraft server. Or you can just store it away, or you can move it from one PC to another, that kind of thing. So let's take a look at where that is. So I'm going to pause the game execution here for a moment. I'm going to bring over File Manager. And we can take a look at the path to the data. It's on your PC, usually on your C drive, users, and then your user ID. Then there's a couple of directories that are usually hidden. AppData, and you can see it's spelled a particular way for application data. Roaming, .minecraft, and then saves. So you can see here I'm in the roaming.minecraft and saves. And then here's the worlds that you've seen when I pull up the menu to say what world are we going to launch. There's New Try World and Survival World and Survive from a long time ago. So these worlds are actually saved on the hard disk, and what you can do is you can zip this entire directory up and it will save the world at that state. You can see I've got one zip file here. But in each of these subdirectories, then you'll see that there are different things. You can see what some of them are called. There is advancements. So in the game, when you get certain achievements or advancements, it saves that. There's also Dimension 1 and Dimension -1, and these are the different world data that you'll see for the different chunks of data in the game, and there's a whole bunch of that here eventually. And this is the New Try World. It's very small, but if I go into Survival World and I look at Dimension 1 data, oh my gosh, there's a whole bunch of stuff here. And then players and regions and so on, there's lots of data. So here's the actual data for regions that are on like a grid, so 0, -2, 0, -1. So as you move from one area to another in the game will preload up the direction you're going in, and that way it can load chunks. And when you see it visually in the game, you get in a minecart, you can see stuff on the edges getting loaded into the game. Not all the data is loaded at once, it loads it in pieces. And then if you look in the top right in your memory allocation, you'll see your memory allocation goes up as it loads chunks, and then it'll take those chunks out of memory, save them off. So there's a lot happening behind the scenes. Let's take a short ride on a railroad so you can see a bit of the chunk loading that's happening outside of your view. Now right now I've got so many things here in the foreground that you can't see what's happening far behind it. Let's take a ride here toward the south. And what we'll do is we'll take a look on the edges of the map, and then eventually you'll see you get new chunks loading in as you're riding. So things that are off in the distance, the computer is going to look and say, okay, you're going to enter this chunk, I need to bring that data in and start rendering it. And you can see it rendering off in the distance. And then what we'll do is we'll actually stop, see how many chunks we're looking at, and then we'll actually add to it to see what's getting rendered. So all these chunks that I'm moving towards are getting loaded in, and all the things I'm moving far enough away from, it's dumping back out. So it's saving these things as we go along. We'll go down here to the south to a raised area, and I'll show you what's going on. Off in the distance, you can only look so far. There's a render distance that you have in the game. There's a small village. We'll be talking about villages pretty soon. And things that are being pulled into view here. There's a wet dog. And let's get here to this southern area. Once I get over to the Rohan view, I'll show you what I mean. Alright, I'm here at a kind of a raised mesa area called Rohan. There's a whole bunch of horses here, kind of make makes sense. And as I'm looking out and scanning in the distance, you can see there's kind of a horizon line. I'll put the targeting cursor on it, and sure enough, that's 12 chunks. I've got my video settings. If I hit escape and then say options, video settings, you can see the render distance here up top right there says the render distance is 12 chunks. Now what I can do is I can increase that distance. If I increase that distance, so let's say 20 chunks, as soon as I go back to the game, it's going to start to load those in and start to render them farther and farther away. So render means to draw or to show them. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to increase this to 20 chunks and say done and done. Now watch on the horizon what happens. It loads in and I'm able to see farther out. Did you see that this mountainous area that's out in the water didn't appear at 12 chunks, but the game had to load more data, more of those files in, more of those files in to get us to be able to see that farther out, and that's happening in all directions. So you can see chunks being loaded in as I walk or ride in that direction as well, and then as I come back, you can see other chunks being loaded in and being rendered. So the distance, the render distance, is important for two things. One, it goes to that area where the data is saved and pulls in chunks of data. It's going to cause the memory allocation to go up, the percent of memory that you're using. If you don't have enough memory, you can't render much farther than about 20 chunks. And so you need to keep it at a reasonable level. Speed of the game and the number of frames per second that the game is going to render to make it more lifelike and less chunky and jumpy, or slow down, is going to be determined by how much area you render. And it's kind of like, it's not linear. So if you go from 12 chunks to 13 chunks, you're adding a whole bunch more chunks, and it slows down geometrically, not linear. Well, point is, if you're having a slow game, use fewer chunks in your render distance. It'll load less into memory, and it has to display less. There's a couple of other things you can do. We'll do a video on that later. But the point is, where is my data saved? It's down on your C drive. Can you save off your game separate from what the game does? Yes, you can zip up one of those files and save it off. You can then share that entire game with someone else who can unzip it in that space, and boom, they've got the same world at that point, but they're disconnected. They can each go kind of forking off in different directions at that point. So you can have some control over the game saves, and you can have some control over what the game displays by, again, going to the escape key up there and then doing options, video settings, render distance. Simulation distance is kind of the same too, but that has to do with how many blocks out redstone works from you. And we can take a look at that later too. So if your game is slowing down, bring your render distance down to maybe 15 or so chunks, 16 chunks, something like that. If you have a fairly decent machine, if you don't have a graphics card, if you have a graphics card, you can actually do a little bit higher render distance. Then if you have a slow hard disk drive instead of a solid state drive, the game's going to be slower to interact with the data that it's got to pull on and off the hard drive, so that's going to slow things down. So a couple of things you can do: change your render distance, and if you have a solid state drive, it's going to be a little faster. So have some fun in your world. Think about where your data is saved if you want to share your world, and then what your render distance can be in order to make the game very smooth and operate well. So there's the answer to the question. See you next time on Minecraft, Dadcraft. Have fun.